Hello everybody and welcome to part 16 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review Series. Today we're going to be continuing the adventures of Ulic Qel-Droma and Nomi Sunrider with the Tales of the Jedi comics, with today's arc encompassing 6 issues titled Dark Lords of the Sith. And as a bonus we're going to be covering a couple of short stories at the end, but for right now, let's go ahead and dive straight into the comics. Our story begins with issue 1 in the year 3997 BBY, 1 year after the Jedi put an end to the Freed Nad uprising on the planet Onderon. On the planet Dantooine, we meet a human Jedi apprentice named Exar Kun, who has stolen a holocron from his master Vodo Syosk Bask to learn about the ancient Dark Lords of the Sith. Exar Kun, through the hologram, witnesses the story of Naga Sadow as he flees the Republic, where the Sith Lord destroyed an entire star system to ensure that the Republic could not follow him into exile. Exar is fascinated by the story, but his master shuts off the holocron, warning that the knowledge in the holocron is dangerous to those other than Jedi Masters. We transition to the Empress Teta system, a place rich in the carbonite ore necessary for the construction of hyperdrive engines. The Darkside cousins Alima and Satal Keto arrive at an orbital smelter station in the system, ostensibly for an educational field trip. The two cousins and their Krath followers suddenly assault the facility and its guards with Darkside illusions, convincing the soldiers that they have been savaged by live snakes. When the cousins emerge victorious, they drop the remaining workers and even Satal's own father into the molten carbonite, securing their power over the facility. The two cousins use their dark powers to torture and dismember their enemies as well as their own servants and discuss killing countless more dissenters in a casual and bored manner. The comic narration tells us that the two have crossed an invisible threshold where the dark side has become ever more corruptive and that they are now total servants to its power. Later, we return to the planet Onderon, where the Jedi victory 1 year prior has ensured an era of peace. However, news of the ongoing coup in the Empress Teta system reaches the Jedi on Onderon, as well as the existence of the Keto cousins and their involvement in Onderon's war. Arca sends a number of Jedi to go to Ossus to prepare the Jedi and the Republic forces for the dark side threat, while Ulic and Nomi stay behind so Arca can teach Nomi more about battle meditation. Ulic and his brother Kay decide to look through some Sith artifacts that are about to be shipped to the Jedi archives. Ulic discovers an artifact that still houses the spirit of Freed Nad, who emerges to tell them that the resurgence of the Sith is inevitable. Eerily, he tells Ulic that he sees in his destiny that he will become a great Sith, and there will be another even greater. With that ominous statement from Nad, we come back to Dantooine to witness Exar Kun defeating his fellow students in practice lightsaber duels. Hoping to temper Exar's arrogance, Master Boss challenges Exar. Though Exar wins and shatters his master's staff, Master Boss admits that while Exar is formidable, he has a place in his heart from which no light escapes. Going into issue 2, Exar Kun comes to Onderon claiming to be a Jedi archaeologist, demanding to see Freed Nad's artifacts, but Master Arca sees through his lie and refuses him, so he continues his search on his own. Exar witnesses a conflict in the streets between the citizens of the city Isis, who support the Jedi rule, and two Nadists who wish for the old dark side ways to return to the city. Exar steps in, not to stop the Nadists, but to recruit them in his quest to find Sith artifacts on the Zune moon. On the moon, Exar discovers the Sith tombs and investigates them, despite his master's voice in his head warning him to turn back. Freed Nad's spirit appears to Exar, and though it's enraged at first, it guides Exar Kun to a set of scrolls hidden underneath his corpse, written by Nad's own master. The two Nadists end up turning on Exar, but he cuts them down in his rage, but the quickness of his readiness to accept the dark side chills Exar, and he begins to remember his master's teachings. Nevertheless, he's still excited to unlock the secrets of the scrolls, which lead him to the Sith homeworld of Korriban. Back at the Empress Teta system, the Krath are closing in on Koros Major, the last planet to hold out against their coup. The Republic, along with Ulic and Nomi, arrive and demand a ceasefire. The Krath choose to respond not with words, but with the illusion of enormous extinct spacefaring beasts, an illusion that Nomi is able to see through thanks to her new skills in battle meditation. When the cousins realize their illusion failed, they send many ships to attack the Republic forces. The Jedi believe the attack is also an illusion, and while they are partially correct, many of the ships are actually real, and the Jedi realize the trick too late. The Krath ships kamikaze into the Republic fleet, and Ulic Qel-Droma is gravely injured. Coming into issue 3, a great number number of Jedi from across the galaxy convene on the world of Deniba to discuss their next move. An aging Oden who has presided over such meetings for 6 centuries, uses telepathy to oversee the intentions of every Jedi present. Ulic Qel-Droma speaks, arguing against a prolonged military campaign against the Krath that would lead to senseless bloodshed. He argues that the only way to fully dismantle the Krath conspiracy is for one of the Jedi to join them and learn how their dark secrets work, but the other Jedi despise the suggestion of flirting with the dark side in such a way. Across the galaxy, Exar Kun, who is absent from the Great Meeting, wanders the dead world of Korriban. Frida Nad's spirit guides him deep within the tombs into a mausoleum that harbors the spirits of ancient Jedi that had opposed the Sith and a lost. Frida Nad suddenly sends the tomb crashing down around Exar, destroying the trapped spirits of the Jedi and crushing Exar's body, telling him that the only way to live is to embrace the dark side. Exar calls out to his master, who attempts to meditate and surround Exar with the power of the light, but Frida Nad's hatred is able to repel him. In the absence of his master's light, Exar finally accepts Nad's plea to join the dark side, and though his wounds are healed, nothing is as it was before. Now revived, Exar Kun is tasked by Frida Nad to go to the fourth moon of Yavin, the resting place of Naga Sadow, to learn from his secrets of Sith alchemy. Suddenly though, Exar is attacked by Sith Tomb Guardians, and though he wishes against it, he is easily able to call upon his anger to summon his lightsaber and destroy them. Back on Deniba, the Jedi Convocation hear the anguished cries of Exar Kun, and soon afterward are ambushed by Krath war droids. In the ensuing battle, Master Arca is struck down by a droid after saving Ulic's life, fading into the Force in his apprentice's arms. After the battle ends, Ulic vows to infiltrate the Krath using his previous plan. Nomi Sumrider comes to comfort him, warning him against the pull of the dark side, but Ulic is steadfast in his wish to avenge his master and save the Republic. Going into issue 4, the Jedi Masters are still trying to advise Ulic not to try and take on the dark side from within. Oden comes to warn Ulic about the dark side with his old Sith holocron, but Ulic struggles to listen, believing he would be a coward not to face the darkness head-on and that the Jedi Elders have become complacent. Even Ulic's brother, Kay, tries to warn him against the mission, but Ulic embarks for Tata above the Kestrel Nova, telling his brother and Nomi not to follow him, but not before giving Nomi a goodbye smooch. You know, for luck. Ulic arrives on Sinagar, the capital world of the Tata system, which has suffered under the rule of the Krath. The cousins are able to sense his arrival, but decide they'll keep him alive in the hope that they can learn things from him about their enemies. During a public execution held by the cousins the next day, assassins emerge to try and take them down, and it appears that they actually have a fighting chance against the Krath. However, Ulic knows that if the cousins die, then their secrets will die with them. Though he hesitates, he kills the rebels and seems to earn the favor of the Krath. Now that Ulic has officially joined the Krath, the two cousins argue over what to do with him, with Satal believing him to be a threat and Alima believing that they should trust him. Across the galaxy, Exar Kun begins his journey on Yavin 4. He is hunted by the Massassi, who have become mutated and violent after years of exposure to Naga Sadow's lingering alchemical and spiritual influence. As Exar attempts to defend himself, he finds that as a consequence of being healed by the dark side, he can no longer call upon the light side. After being chased by the Massassi, Exar is discovered by the Sith priest Zithmanir, who takes him to a place called the Temple of Fire to be crucified, I guess. As the Sith in the audience chamber begin to chant, an enormous dark side creature emerges. Frida Nad urges Exar to focus on the dark side to save himself. Focusing on specifically his hatred for Nad, Exar summons the Sith amulet controlling the creature and uses the amplifit to amplify his own hatred and powers, destroying the creature. The Massassi are grateful to Exar for the creature's destruction, and Nad is also pleased. Nad tries to get Exar to begin helping him using Sadow's alchemy to create a brand new body, but in his sheer hatred for Nad, Exar uses the power of the amulet to destroy Nad's spirit, but not before Nad calls out into the Force. At this moment, the cousins hear the call of Frida Nad, who warns them that it is not Ulic they have to worry about, but Exar Kun, who he calls a pretender to the Sith legacy. With his dying words, he states that he believes that the true Sith legacy lies with Alima, Satal, and Ulic. Starting issue 5, the cousins are still arguing over what to do with Ulic as the Jedi is kept imprisoned at the mercy of a torture droid. Satal tests him by injecting him with Sith poison, which nearly kills Ulic, but he defends himself with a burst of Force Force power. Kay and Nomi take the Nebulon Ranger to Sinagar to try and pursue Ulic. While trying to locate him on the planet, Nomi allows herself to be captured by the Krath. She is brought to Ulic and the cousins, and in order to maintain his facade, Ulic forces down his feelings for Nomi and tells the Krath that he will execute her at dawn. After this, Alima appears to become more infatuated with him, and Ulic decides that he could use this to his advantage. Satal intercepts a droid Ulic sent to give a message to Nomi. Discovering Ulic's treachery, Satal sends an assassin to kill Ulic, who easily defends himself. Using her battle meditation skills, Nomi is able to get past the guards blocking her cell and escape to the city, where she meets back with Kay. Ulic and Satal arrive as well, and the two duel. During the duel, Ulic gives in to his anger, which is amplified by the Sith poison. Ulic strikes down Satal, but in his blind rage, also threatens his own brother with his dark power. Realizing they have no choice, the other Jedi flee Sinagar without Ulic. Both Nomi and Kay come to the realization that Ulic is on a path with which there is no return, and that he may be lost for good. On Yavin 4, Exar Kun has officially become the leader of the Massassi and orders them to build even more temples. Exar continues his arcane research, searching deep underground until he finds the ship that brought the original Sith to the moon. With his own ship destroyed by the Massassi, he hopes that the ship is still operational, but also finds a trove of Sith alchemical equipment. Exar uses the Sith priest Zithmanir as the first subject for his experiments in metamorphosis, turning him into a mindless servant of death. Eventually, Exar takes flight in the old Sith ship, determined to hunt down the ones that he sees as a threat to his new power. Going into the 6th and final issue, Kay and Nomi approach the Elder Jedi for their approval to go back to Sinagar and rescue Ulic. Although the Jedi let them proceed with the mission, the Masters believe that the Jedi that walk the dark path must face the consequences of their actions on their own. If it is Ulic's destiny to be destroyed by the dark side, the Masters believe that they shouldn't interfere. At Sinagar, Exar Kun and his Massassi arrive and make their way towards Ulic and Alima as Exar's Sith amulet begins to respond to one of the Kraths. Suddenly, the Republic attack force from Ossus arrives and the Jedi begin attacking the city, where they must face laser cannons that were designed by Ulic. Nomi arrives to confront Alima and dispels her illusions, trying to break through to Ulic, but neither she nor his brother can get to him to come back willingly. Despite the protests of Kay and the other Jedi, Nomi ultimately decides to not force Ulic to come back with them, heeding the words of their masters and allowing Ulic to face the consequences of his own choices. Just as the Jedi leave, Exar Kun arrives to face all of his new rivals. As Ulic and Exar duel, the energies of their Sith amulets begin to combine, and the spirits of past Sith are summoned. The Sith, from their shared vision, brand Exar Kun as the next Dark Lord of the Sith, and Ulic Qel-Droma as his first apprentice. To Alima's surprise, Ulic and Exar are now allies, and stronger than ever. Whew. So, another great comic arc. The stars here are, of course, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma, who I feel like are fantastic foils for each other. Even before they meet, they have all of these interesting characteristics that you can contrast, and they do so much to illustrate why Jedi fall to the dark side, which I feel is the main theme of this arc, if not the Tales of the Jedi story as a whole. On one hand, we have Exar, who is arrogant and ambitious and wants to learn about the dark side for his own personal gain, and even though he regrets his choices only when it's too late, he very quickly surrenders to the dark side power and how it gives him the knowledge and the power that he's always wanted. And then on the other hand, we have Ulic Qel-Droma, who's always been generally a pretty noble Jedi, but becomes obsessed with revenge and power after the death of his beloved master, and then he just becomes more and more entrenched in the dark side as he grows more arrogant and craves more power to kind of fix what he sees were flaws in the Republic that led to the death of his master. The big lesson here is that it doesn't matter if your ambitions are selfish or altruistic, or if they're self-serving or not. If you stay on the dark path for long enough, it doesn't matter what your intentions are, you're still going to become obsessed and consumed with anger and greed. Like I touched on in the last video, it's pretty cool. It's really amazing how these journeys of these older dark Jedi kind of reflect the fall of Anakin Skywalker, even though these comics came out a decade before Revenge of the Sith did. Parts of this journey also remind me of Dark Disciple, which is a canon book which also covers themes of things that the Jedi decide to do that are bad or dark but are ultimately done to kind of pursue noble goals, but how stooping to the level of your dark enemies is a bad thing. Investigating how one fights evil and how one resists becoming evil themselves will always be one of my favorite and one of the most important thematic elements of Star Wars. And I'd say Dark Lords of the Sith is a really excellent illustration of two very different Jedi who end up going along more or less the same dark path. It's like, even though Ulick's master never wanted Ulick to go that way, ultimately it's Ulick's own selfish kind of quest for power that ultimately almost replaces the thing that he originally wanted in the first place. Again, it's very much like Anakin turning into Vader. He just wanted to save his wife, but once he became Vader, he didn't have Padme, he didn't have the Republic or his friends, and then he just became bad because at that point, that was all that he had left. And I feel like the same thing has definitely happened for XR, and I think the same could happen for Ulick as well. It seems like the main lesson that the dark side teaches in Star Wars is that if you let these emotions of greed and ambition and fear and anger drive you and push you, you stop being the good person that you might have once been. And though the power might feel good in the short term, it's all going to come crashing down later. Ulick has essentially severed his connection to the Jedi Order and his friends and his brother and the people he cared about most, even though at the first he sought to benefit and protect them from a Republic and a Jedi Order that he thought were flawed ideologically. It's a little bit more dramatic than how something like that might happen in real life, but I think what Star Wars is ultimately trying to teach here is to stick to your principles and not lose sight of being a good person and having healthy interpersonal relationships when pursuing your ambitions. As for the characters, Exar Kun is just an excellent wild card to introduce into this story. He just ends up affecting the plot so much even when he's not around the other characters, and after a certain point I feel like I could guess where Ulick's story was going, but I could never really anticipate exactly what was going to happen in Exar Kun's story. I actually had to move some things around in my plot summary just to make things a little more coherent, because in the comic everything jumps around and Ulick's journey is very much tied to everyone else's journey pacing wise, even if he's not physically there, and it actually makes for just like a really electric story that really keeps you invested in everything at once. And although the two Krath cousins weren't as central this time, I do still feel like that they are interesting to compare and contrast with Ulick and Exar. Compared to the two Jedi, the cousins are even more arrogant and just blatantly evil, and I feel like that makes them just an interesting enough threat to spur on the character development of characters like Ulick. I'm very happy that one of the characters died just for like karmic and story reasons, but honestly I wish it was a little bit more horrific. I wish it was a little more Faustian deal with the devil, because I don't really like these cousin characters too much, and I kind of wish that they had you got what's coming to you kind of thing, because they are so ready to just use these powers so strongly against people who are innocent. So I was hoping it would be kind of like an Indiana Jones style death where they got devoured by the very powers they were just so eager to possess. But I mean, I think them dying as a result of them pursuing a dark path at any rate is fine, I guess. Yeah, I really don't mind just Satal simply exiting the story, giving Alima a little more weight to the story, and just having Ulick and Exar be the interesting characters who carry the plot along. I really like how Alima's powers are based on deception and not like brute force, and I like how she is in that way kind of a foil to Nomi, whose like light side battle meditation abilities are a perfect counter to Alima's illusions, and whenever Alima or Nomi enter the battlefield, or when they're both there, it makes for a really interesting and unique and unpredictable fight. I have to say though, and this might be because I'm not super familiar with a lot of the sword and sorcery like fantasy tropes that this series seems to be drawing on, but I'm not a huge fan of how Alima has now essentially been reduced to just kind of this scantily clad seductress sorceress type character. I think Ulick already had enough interesting things going on with his motivation and his turning to the dark side without there needing to be this weird romantic sexual element to it. Yeah, I just didn't really think that was necessary at all. Maybe it'll come into play more later. So beyond characters in this arc, I also really loved a lot of the little lore connections that we are beginning to see. Satal and Alima are apparently the first people in history to freeze people in carbonite, which is neat. I love how they're expanding on world building elements that we see in the original movies and showing the origin of those. I don't think they need to do that for everything, but to see that happen every once in a while is always really fun. I'm imagining that dipping them in the molten carbonite the way they did, it just kills them, even if it preserves their bodies, kind of. I don't think it's the same as the carbon freezing and the hibernation that is there in The Empire Strikes Back, but again, that just goes to show how evil they are, and that's great. The Sith tomb on Korriban is made out of what's called Mandalorian iron, which of course later will be known as Beskar, which I did not expect Mandalorians or any of the plot or world building elements were related to them to show up this early in the timeline, so that's pretty neat. Odin of course, makes an appearance as a very old Jedi Master. I wasn't sure if he was going to pop up outside of the Great Hyperspace War arc, which of course Odin was actually introduced first in this arc, because I feel like I'd already said before, the Ulic Qel-Droma stories actually came out before the Great Hyperspace ones. But yeah, Odin is definitely one of my favorite Legends Glup Shidos, so I really loved him making an appearance as just a really old alien. I think one of my favorite Star Wars tropes from the High Republic or the prequels or this era or whatever are really old, really weird alien Jedi that have been around for 100 years and don't look very humanoid. Those are always some of my favorite characters. Some other cool Jedi include the aliens Kurl Tok and the Mirulaka Shoaneb Kulu. I think that's how you say their names. Shoaneb has no eyes, and I think her species can only see through the Force. I'm hoping that we get to see more of them later, because I always love when there's a species where it's a human, but they have this one really weird trait, and Star Wars always has weird creative stuff like that. Master Syosk Bass being able to use just his staff to parry Exar Kun's lightsaber is awesome. I have never seen the application of the Force like that, using a normal weapon but enhancing it with the Force enough that you can actually block a lightsaber blade, is super cool. I don't know why I haven't seen that or why I haven't thought of that before, but that was amazing. Master Arca also mentions being able to defeat droids very easily by using the Force just to dismantle their internal circuitry. I've been mentioning before how I become more comfortable with the Force becoming a little bit more of like a hard fantasy system with a certain amount of set rules. I've been mentioning more and more how I'm getting more and more comfortable with the Force kind of becoming this slightly harder magic system with like a set of rules or learned techniques, but really this just feels more like a natural extension of combat experience, and for some reason I found it really cool that Master Arca could do that and the younger students could not. It's like, compare that with how Luke destroys the Dark Troopers in The Mandalorian. Like, of course Luke is very powerful and very experienced, but he just crushes them and it takes several seconds, while, you know, it's a robot where you could just, you know, flip a switch in its brain and it would shut right off, and that's what Master Arca has essentially learned how to do. And it makes so much sense that an ancient Jedi who has fought a lot of different kinds of enemies would know how to do that and would know how to use the Force very quickly and efficiently and less violently and with less brute force, and I just thought that was a fantastic detail. The art is fantastically fantastic as usual. I did want to point out that from these issues, I really love the use of colors other than black to represent space, and I especially like how Exar Kun's lightsaber is like dripping with this energy. The lightsabers have always looked a little unique in these comics, but Exar Kun's lightsaber here takes it to a completely different level. I wonder if that's maybe supposed to represent some kind of in-universe, the differences in how he views lightsaber combat and the way that he views the Force in general as something that is like dripping with power. Probably not, but I love the little liberties that the artists are taking with like these well-known world building elements such as lightsabers and taking them to like their conceptual and visual extremes, and just, it's an ancient era where things look different, so why can't the lightsabers look different too? Also, the pencil drawn covers for all of the Tales of the Jedi comics are just awesome. I love seeing the characters from these comics rendered in more detail, and just awesome compositions from all of the covers too. I almost wish I had like the original like individual copies of these comics just because the covers look that good. So all in all, I think that Dark Lords of the Sith is an excellent continuation of the Tales of the Jedi story. It's a fantastic escalation of stakes packed inside a story with character arcs that really work wonders for all of the characters involved, and really it just does a lot of really good work to further explore some of the core themes of the saga as a whole. I'm going to give this a super solid 5 Sith monsters out of 5. I'm really excited to see the climax of this story. Tom Veitch and Kevin J. Anderson have really got me hook, line, and sinker with this whole series. I also just wanted to mention quickly, just like the past 2 arcs, the Dark Lords of the Sith have a dedicated audio drama adaptation. There's 2 versions of them, and I'll link them below in the description, but I have have to say that, again, in my opinion, the audio drama version of these stories really are not the definitive way to read these stories. If you really want to experience these stories, I think the way that they're really meant to, you're going to want to read the comics. Every Star Wars audiobook or audio production that I've read is high quality and is a good, fun read, but I'd say if you're going to do one or the other, just do the comics, unless for some reason you can't access the comics or you just want to really be a completionist. But before we go today, let's unwind with a couple of little short stories that take place around the same time period, starting with the short story The Most Dangerous Foe by Angela Phillips, which can be found in the 11th issue of the Star Wars Adventure Journal. This story takes place around 4000 BBY and tells the story of a 16-year-old Jedi trainee named Vicky Ramuni, who has just built her first lightsaber. Her master tells her that if she can pass the test of the Cave of Truth, then she will finally be a true Jedi. However, her 10-year-old brother Venny follows her and brings her lightsaber in defiance of the rules of the trial. The two siblings approach the mountains after nightfall and come face to face with a threatening reptilian creature with leathery wings and many pairs of limbs. Vicky activates her red-bladed lightsaber to confront the beast, but it begins to speak, identifying itself as a Jedi Master, and that he is actually to be Vicky's escort to the Cave of Truth. Eventually, the three come to a rock face with no obvious entrance, but Vicky is able to detect an opening, clearing some rocks with the Force. She rushes towards the end of the cave, facing a dead end, before realizing that she had rushed right past a door in her impatience. The door leads to a well-lit room with a table filled with delicious food. She's tempted to sit down and rest and eat after her long journey, but decides she should push on with her test instead. Suddenly, the food turns rotten and she sees a vision of her own corpse. Vicky finds another door that opens up into an immense void with howling winds, but realizing that it's the only way forward, Vicky decides to trust the Force and steps into the void. The winds carry her into a narrow tunnel, which leads to a chamber that houses an immensely valuable Karuska gem. In this moment, she remembers her parents and realizes that the gem is worth more than enough to give her parents a luxurious life, freeing them from a tedious existence of farming. But, like the previous room, she recognizes that this is just part of the test and resists the temptation once again. Pressing on, she finds a chamber of mirrors. In the mirrors, she sees illusions of her parents as well as places she's known throughout her life. While distracted, the mirrors close in around her and water begins to seep into the room. As the water rises, Vicky begins to panic. She draws her lightsaber to cut her way out, but catches her reflection in the mirrors, seeing how frightening she has made herself appear in her anger. Letting go of her anger now, Vicky reaches through the mirror and passes right through it to see her master on the other side. By discussing her recent trials with her master, Vicky understands that each element of the cave, the door, the food, the winds, the crystal, and the mirrors, all serve to allow Vicky to overcome impatience, physical limits, fear, doubt, greed, and anger, respectively. The lesson is revealed to be this, that it is possible that oneself can be one's own greatest enemy, and that the only thing that can truly separate a Jedi from the Force is their own emotions. Okay, that was a cute little story. The prose is perfectly serviceable, and there's illustrations in here that are pretty good. It's not a bad read, it didn't overstay its welcome in terms of length, and all the characters felt like neat little archetypes that were perfect for their place in the story. I like this little story because it feels like a microcosm of a lot of the things that Star Wars is about, especially how it teaches that one should always be patient and humble and calm in extreme situations. I have to say though, I'm a little frustrated when Star Wars gives advice like don't get angry or resist temptation within the parameters of like survival stories like these. Like telling someone to stay calm in a perilous situation is decent advice, but if you have someone who's not a Force user who's taking some elaborate Jedi test is about to drown, it's not really practical advice. The only reason not being angry was the right thing to do here is because completing that specific Jedi test only required you to just exist in that emotional state, not that being in that emotional state makes it easier to find a solution to the actual problem you're in. But whatever, I'm probably not supposed to think about it that hard. It was a good story with some nice little lessons in it, and it reflects a lot of what Star Wars is about within 10 pages or so. I do have one more small thing to bring up about this story, in that the story is told through a frame story. Basically, if you don't already know, a frame story is when a fictional story is written through the lens of somebody telling it elsewhere in the future. In this case, the tale of Vicky Ramuni is told by a character named Dean Vorson, who is a rebel telling this story to some children during the evacuation of the Yavin 4 base in 0 BBY. We'll probably see some other stories and possibly even some novels or other bigger story content told in the form of frame stories in the future, but because the bulk of this story does take place in 4000 BBY, obviously I'm going to put it at this place in the timeline. usually the core story is going to dictate where we put the story in the chronological review. So the next short story is A Tale from the Dark Side, written by George R. Straighten, that comes from the Tales of the Jedi Companion, another role-playing source book from the olden days of the 90s. This story follows the female human, Vara Nareem, whose goal is to know the ways of the Sith, but without falling to the dark side. She travels to the site of a Sith temple on the planet Crayus II. After encountering an obelisk and reciting a Sith chant, the temple rises out of the ground, and she enters. She's confronted by a shadowy Sith spirit who interrogates her about her intentions. Vara claims to be neither Jedi nor Sith, and wants to learn both sides of the Force, but the Sith spirit sees through her ruse and fatally attacks her. Before she dies, Vara's last wish is that she could have warned other Jedi who sought the same path to not underestimate the dark side like she had. So this story is a lot shorter than the last one, and it seems like that its moral is pretty straightforward. You should not try and learn about the dark side, not even dabble in it a little bit, because if you do, the Sith spirit will be able to figure out what you're doing, and you'll end up dead. Essentially, it's just a very condensed version, I think, of the story that we got in Dark Lords of the Sith, where if you're going to try and dabble in both the light side and the dark is going to consume you, and it seems like that Sith spirits have a really intense hatred for people who try and kind of walk the line and do both. So again, there's not much of a theme here, except if you try and go down the dark path, you'll end up seriously messed up or dead, especially if you're a Jedi. Again, it's not a story that has a lot of practical use to someone who's not in the Star Wars universe, but again, I do like this general theme that we're seeing in the Tales of the Jedi comics and the surrounding stories, that if you try and kind of get this dark knowledge, or try and learn dark side based powers, which are ultimately based on fear or greed or anger, it's not going to end up well for you. So one last thing before I sign off, I'm not 100% sure why the timeline websites I use to construct my own timeline insist that these two stories go in between Dark Lords of the Sith and the Sith War, other than they just say they're from 4000 BBY, because 3997 BBY feels like a pretty specific placement. Ultimately, I'm really happy we did cover them in this episode, because I feel like they are kind of like a microcosmic version of the themes and stories that we just covered in Dark Lords of the Sith, but it just feels like these stories could have happened literally any time before the fall of the Republic. But yeah, I don't know, I guess, for myself, what the proper placement of these stories along a timeline is going to be until I read them, and the more that I go and read these stories, I care less and less about being granular about the timeline placement, the more I do this series anyway. I just want to read some good stories, and if I'm lucky, the stories that I cover in one episode or in one cluster of episodes are going to cover a lot of the same stuff. Alright, I think that does it for today's episode. Next time we are going to be continuing our Tales of the Jedi Odyssey and the adventures of Ulic, Nomi, and Exar, with the penultimate Tales of the Jedi arc titled The Sith War. Ooh. So like always, thank you for watching, and may the Force be with you always.